Imagine if you could easily find solutions to make your region or city smarter, greener, better connected, more social, and closer to citizens. The Interreg Europe Policy Learning Platform can help you access knowledge about the latest policy trends, discover expert-validated good practices from all over Europe, find solutions in our peer review, get tailored support from our expert team. We can connect you with the right people and organizations. Together, we will find ways to solve your region's or city's challenges. Start your policy learning journey today.
Oh, sorry. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Interreg Europe Policy Learning Platform webinar. First out of two in a mini-series on climate adaptation in deltas. Today, we will focus on coastal restoration. And by the way, today is an important day because we have a vote on the European nature restoration law as well. My name is Magda Michaliková, and I am a thematic expert for environment and resource efficiency at the Interreg Europe Policy Learning Platform. With me today, I have my two expert colleagues, Astrid Severin, who is also a thematic expert for environment and resource efficiency, and Lotte van Meel from our communications team. Before we start, I would like to share some housekeeping rules. This webinar is recorded, and you will be able to find the recording online after the event, along with all of today's presentations. During the webinar, we will share useful information and links in the chat, and we also encourage you to take the opportunity to interact with our speakers and post your questions in the chat as well. At the end of this webinar, we will share a short survey where you can give us feedback. So please fill that one out because it helps us a lot to improve our future events. And to get to know you a little bit as well, we have prepared two polls, which I would like to ask Lotte to share now. And the first one is about what type of organization you represent. So maybe you are coming from an EU institution, maybe you're from a local, regional, or national authority, and you're a policymaker. Maybe you're coming from a private organization or a consultancy, from NGO or a fund, from academia or from other type of organization. And if that's the case, please let us know in the chat. So we will give you some time to answer. Okay, and here we have the results. And we see that the most of you are coming from local, region, or national authority, 43%. So that's quite a majority. And then we have about 20% from academia, 15% from NGO or fund, and then some of you coming also from private organizations or EU institutions. And then we have a second poll as well, where we would like to know what are your main interests to attend this workshop. And you can answer with multiple choice. And perhaps you're coming because you're interested in climate adaptation measures in deltas or in coastal regions. You're interested in coastal restoration approaches or in ecosystem services in deltas and coastal regions. So we'll give you a little time again to fill out this form, this poll. Okay, and we have about 70% interested in climate adaptation measures in deltas and coastal restoration approaches, but also a lot interested in ecosystem services. So that's great because we will look at all of these aspects today. So let's look at the agenda of today's webinar. So after my short introductory presentation, we will have a keynote presentation from Joep Verhagen from the Global Center on Adaptation from the Netherlands. And he will talk about climate adaptation in deltas. After the keynote presentation, we will have 3 examples of good practices and policy changes. First one will be by Nil Alvarez Segura from Spain, who will talk about challenges of coastal restoration in the Ebro Delta. Second presentation will be from Massimiliano Costa from Italy, and he will talk about coastal restoration measures in the Po Delta. And the last presentation will be from David Daron from Ireland, talking about ecosystem services in coastal habitats in Ireland. There will be an opportunity to ask questions throughout the webinar, so please do that. And just to share with you, we also have some interesting resources for you at the Policy Learning platform. We have a number of policy briefs that are connected to the subject. There is a policy, yes, and you can see them here, and my colleague Lotte will also share links with you in the chat. We, of course, have these webinars. There is a webinar on the 28th of June, which you are warmly welcome to attend as well. We have other resources such as a recording of workshop on natural and cultural heritage in coastal regions, or follow-up notes, articles from our matchmakings on the coastal topics. And we also have a peer review service. So peer reviews are these 2-day really intense collaborative learning events where we address a policy challenge that you have. So you can apply for the peer review with a challenge that you have, and then we find relevant peers and experts who will basically help you to tackle it. And we've had already a number of peer reviews on the topic of nature restoration and biodiversity, and here are just a few examples. We are having one actually next week, where we will look at protecting and recovering local biodiversity in Norfolk County Council. So you can see that these topics are very good topics for peer reviews. And that would be all from me for this short introduction. And before we go to our keynote speaker, we would like to ask you again to engage with us in 2 polls. So I would like to, yes. The first one is a bit of testing your knowledge. And we are asking, how many people do you think live in Delta and coastal urban regions globally today? Is it 500 million? Is it 750 million? Or is it 1 billion? So take your guess. We'll give you still a little bit of time. And let's see. So 50% of you think it's 1 billion. But as we will maybe hear from our keynote speaker, it's actually 500 million. And the other question is not testing your knowledge that much. And we would like to know if your region or organization has a climate adaptation strategy. Very simple answers: yes, no, I don't know. So again, giving you a little bit of time to vote. Yes, great. Okay, so 77% of you you have climate adaptation strategies. So that's great. 15% are still developing it, and 8% don't know. Okay, great. So hopefully these presentations today will inspire those who are developing their strategies and those who already have their strategies developed. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Joep Verhagen from the Global Center on Adaptation, who will give us, as I've mentioned, an introduction to the climate adaptation in deltas and a little bit of a global outlook. So Joep, we're very pleased to have you here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Magda, for the introduction. In my presentation, there were 4 things I'll touch upon. One is that climate adaptation is predominantly an economic and human development agenda. I briefly introduced GCA, the work we do. I'll then dive deeper into climate adaptation in delta and coastal areas, and a few very short examples. Trying to move my slides. Yeah, there we go. The first point I like to make, and because we often talk about the 1.5 degree, that there is not really a safe climate scenario, right? And this slide presents or gives an overview of some of the impacts of climate change on different sectors, which food, water, cities, infrastructure. And what you see that even at a 1.5 degree scenario, the one that we are very close to right now, we already see a 6% global decline in maize crop, basically one of the key staple foods across the globe. For water, about 271 million people will be exposed to water. Additional people will be exposed to water scarcity. If we go up further, let's say to a 3 or 3.5 degree scenario, you see that for water, 10 months average will be, the average length of a drought will be 10 months as compared to 2 months, 2 months at the 1.5 degree scenario. And sea level rise is gonna rise by 1 meter by 2080. So the climate change is going to impact our lives in a very drastic way. Water is the medium to what we feel most of and experience most of the effects and impacts of climate change. Rising temperature will lead to too little, too much, and more polluted water. And often we see more and more that we have places that both experience droughts and more frequent droughts, but also will experience more frequent and more intense floods. The graph on the right shows the intensity of extreme weather events. The blue ones is extremely wet, and the brown ones are extremely dry. And what you see is that even now, the intensity of extreme weather events is increasing. So we are already experiencing the impact of climate change as we speak. As GCA, we predominantly work in Africa and Asia. In the developing countries, we do much less in Asia. But the Global Commission on Adaptation looked at what is needed to adapt to a new climate and what the economic benefits would be. And we did it in 5 areas. Basically, we looked at early warning systems, making new infrastructure climate resilient, improving dryland agriculture and crop production, protection mangroves, and making water resources management more resilient. And what you see for all these 5 areas, you see that the economic benefits of investing money is very significant. For new infrastructure, it's actually for every dollar or every euro invested, the returns are 4. So climate adaptation is an economic agenda. It's a human development agenda. At the same time, if we invest in climate adaptation, there are significant economic returns to do so. And we strongly believe that climate adaptation and investing in climate adaptation is smart economics. And we also, when we go to countries, when we work in countries, we always will advocate that the climate agenda should sit with the Ministry of Finance or Economic Affairs, not with the Ministry of Environment. Now, what is happening currently? Are we actually acting on the insight that investing in adaptation is smart economics? No. The picture on the right shows that according to estimates, around $52.7 billion is needed in Africa to be invested in climate adaptation. There is a gap of $41.3 billion. Very significant. Mind you that Africa so far only contributed about 3% of the total CO2 greenhouse gas emissions till date. So though they contribute very little, and that is also true for the small islands in the Pacific and the Caribbean, they are the ones hit hardest by the impact of climate change. And I believe that as a human global community, we have a strong responsibility and obligation towards towards people in Africa and Asia and the small islands to actually rectify this and help them to adapt to a new climate. This is taken in front of our office. We are sitting in the largest floating office in the world. It's a climate adapted building. So even if the place gets flooded, we go with the floods and we go down with the floods. And we hold every year an annual event. This is the Africa Adaptation Summit, where 4 African heads of states, our Prime Minister, Mr. Rutte, but also the manager, the director of the IMF, the president of the African Development Bank, all came together to do 2 things. One is a call to action to put climate adaptation higher on the agenda. And secondly, a call to the developed nations to come good on their promise made in Paris 2015 to mobilize the $100 billion or euros a year to be transferred from the developed countries to the developing countries. This at the moment is still not happening. But what you see is that it's a very diverse group of people from Africa, people from Europe. And what we do, we work with countries, and we work with the development banks like the World Bank, AFDB, to help them to make their infrastructure, to make their agriculture, to make their water supply more climate resilient. Moving from the global picture to delta and coastal areas. What we see is that the deltas and the coasts are the places where our ambition as human beings to be better developed, to be better off, clashes hardest and foremost with the reality of climate change. Looking at coastal areas, about 40% of the global population lives within 100 kilometers of a coast. And that is just 20% of our land mass. So the coastal areas are more densely populated. They're also the areas where most of our economic activities take place. About 2/3 of global GDP is generated within 100 kilometers of a coast. 14 out of the 17 megacities in the world are located at the coast. You think about Lagos, you think about Mumbai. In the US, you think about Washington, New York. So most of our economic activities, most of where we live, are all coastal areas. And these are exactly the places that are hit hardest by climate change. Deltas, apart from being very fertile, also very rich and biodiverse ecosystems. So also there, we feel the impacts. I just have to look outside. I'm sitting in the Netherlands, and we all know it's true. 2 small examples of how does it look like. One country we work a lot of, where I work like a Senegal. It's situated on the western part of Africa, on the coast. In Senegal, 75% of the population lives at the coast. 95% of the formal economic activities takes place at the coast. And we see that coastal degradation, urban floods, sea level rise is hitting Senegal very hard. They lose altogether, put together, about 7% of GDP on an annual basis because of coastal, the impact of climate change on that coast. What we see at the same time, Senegal has to deal with a large group of stakeholders that all have a stake in the coast. Think about the Ministry of Tourism, because there are a lot of hotels there, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Ocean, Fisheries, Planning, Urban Development. At the moment, there is no coordinated effort to come together to develop a integrated coastal management plan. And we see this happening in many places of the world. A small question, if the original beach that was public property floods, erodes away, then who owns the new beach? Because many people depend on their livelihoods, on access to the beach. The Netherlands, very different scene, like again, about a quarter of the country is below sea level. 59% in total is vulnerable to flooding. 70% of our population lives in these areas. And our economy is highly concentrated at the coast. We are well protected for floods. We use a multi-layered approach. We have protection, we use spatial planning, we use contingency measures. But when it floods, though the likelihood is very low, we will be highly impacted. If, for instance, the city of Rotterdam floods, it means that our economy will get a massive hit, but also the economy in the hinterland in Germany will get a huge hit. We do have dedicated infrastructure and institutional structure. We have dedicated budgets all the way up to 2034 to protect our country, to protect the Netherlands from the impact of climate change. But still, we see that the likelihood of floods, and we all remember the floods of last year in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands, the droughts we are about to experience very soon in the next few weeks, intensity, frequency is increasing. And the question also arises, are we really prepared for sea level rise? What happens if sea level rises by 2 meters? What will happen with our credit rating, right? The Netherlands right now is rated as a triple A country, so it's cheap for the Netherlands to borrow money. What happens if people start fearing that all the key infrastructure will flood because of sea level rise? We've done to get a better grip on how do we accelerate and how do we scale up climate change adaptation in deltas. We looked at 6 lighthouse case studies in Argentina, Bangladesh, Colombia, Indonesia, Mozambique, the Netherlands, and Vietnam. And the publication is available on our website. I like to share some of the highlights of the key lessons that we derived from these case studies, and to see whether they are applicable elsewhere as well. One is that we see that we still need to work on a better understanding of what works and what doesn't work in delta environments, and share these lessons more effectively. We may feel that in the Netherlands, understanding is well developed, but we also know that in other regions of the world, it's not the case. It's complex. There are many intervening factors, and if you want to work on climate adaptation in deltas, you need to look at through a system lens, take everything into account, and understand that you are intervening in a very complex system. Though we need to act fast, it's also a long-term game. Example, for instance, the example of the Netherlands, we had a massive flood in 1953. It took us a better part of 45 years to complete the delta works in the Netherlands that are supposed to protect the coast better. So 45 years it took. There's the large project Room for the River. It's gone faster, but still it's 30 years. Bangladesh has a Delta Plan 2100, so they're looking 80 years ahead. Local communities are absolutely key. If we don't work with local communities, it will not work. And communities are there at different levels. But it's important to involve local stakeholders in climate adaptation actions in deltas. We see also in the case studies that the combination of gray and green solutions has a huge potential. But in many cases, for instance, Vietnam, for instance, Indonesia, or the Netherlands, most of the green-gray solutions are still at a small scale, are still at the pilot stage, and we really need to find ways to scale it up. Almost at the end, two remaining recommendations from the report. We need dedicated governance structures, and they need to be organized on water management principles. So at the basin level, right? Often the administrative boundaries of cities or even countries do not coincide with the water management geographies, and hence there is a tension between a city that stops at its boundaries and the larger basin it's situated in. And finally, what is crucial, it needs a long-term commitment to finance adaptation. I already mentioned in the Netherlands, there's actually a budget allocation of about 1.2 billion a year, all the way up to 2034. And we feel, what this case study show is that this long-term commitment to finance adaptation is absolutely crucial to work on adaptation. As I mentioned, a quick few examples of how cities and deltas or cities at coast have adapted. This is
last minute, please.
Yes, I'm almost done. This is the example of Singapore. The picture in the middle is the initial drainage canal, is the drainage canal as it used to look like. And you see it was developed in a park, giving space to the river, making sure that flooding didn't happen, that more water was retained. Similar example, this is Rotterdam, the water square. Again, it's a structure that combines recreation, a space for people to meet, and a place to store water. And talking to my colleagues who work in Rotterdam, they say that's always crucial. Climate adaptation is sold as a measure to improve the livability of the city, not as something to improve the resilience against climate. A soccer stadium with the same function, store water and slowly drain it away. The last slide from my side. So far, and in many cases, including this presentation, we talk about the public sector. The city of Rotterdam is 40% publicly owned. 60% of the buildings and the spaces in the city of Rotterdam are privately owned. What is needed is that we find ways to take the private sector along in our journey to a more climate resilient world. Thank you very much for your attention, and Magda, back to you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for this excellent presentation and for providing us with the global outlook. You've mentioned something that's very important, that climate adaptation is economic and sustainable development agenda. And you've talked about the significant economic benefits and the need for long-term financing. So it's apparent the connection with the economics. And you said investing in climate protection is a smart investment. How can we monetize the return of this investment? How do you think we could attach a financial return to the money invested when the monetary impact is rather damage avoidance than money actually earned?
So there's the two important things to consider. One is, of course, well, the impact of the financial impacts or economic impacts of climate change fall out, can be distinguished and can be split up in two parts. One is the loss of infrastructure that needs to be repaired. The other part is the damage it does to services like food production, transportation, water, and so on. And you see that the damage is mostly far larger than the immediate losses of infrastructure. I on purpose use the word economic returns and not financial returns. So from an economic perspective, it makes a lot of sense to invest this money to avoid the losses and damage. Monetizing, and I think that that's where part of it that's why adaptation at the moment is not fully financed. Monetizing it's often more difficult. But in the city of Rotterdam, we're seeing some first signs, like say, you have buildings with green roofs that absorb rainwater, that reduce the runoff. At the same time, insurance companies now have found that buildings with green roofs have less leakages, and they are starting to reduce the insurance premiums for those buildings with the green roofs. And then when you see like where the private sector can take over, where let's say people start to gain money by investing in climate adaptation.
Yeah, that's a very good example, and something that for sure should be communicated, because that's, I think, one of the ways how we can get it to speed. You've also talked about, well, you've talked about the changes that we're going to see and how they differ with the intensifying speed of climate change, basically. And we already see these changes all over the world, but also in Europe. And you've talked a lot from the global perspective, also mentioning some European examples. Well, your home country, of course. But if you look at Europe and Europe's approach to coastal restoration, how would you assess it? Do you think it's good? It's good enough? There's room for improvement. What should be done?
Someone was sending a message in the chat box about the vote on the part of the Green Deal. To me, and I'm very purposely highlight the importance of the economic and human development agenda, because no matter how sad it is, ecosystems and animals and birds and plants don't sell to the larger politicians that have a often a very short time horizon. Like it's very sad, but that's what we continue to see. Though when biodiversity and green spaces are incredibly important for us, I think that in Europe the urgency is still not fully recognized. And I also would like to highlight, it's not just climate adaptation, right? There are a lot of, if you look at the Potsdam Institute that talks about the 7 planetary boundaries, climate change is just one of the issues we have to deal with. And we are not aware enough of the urgency to adapt and to also reduce pollution and to be far more careful with our nature, because we depend on it. That's what I see. And it's not a happy message for me.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions for Joep from maybe from our speakers? No. So if not, if you still have some questions, please post them in the chat and we can answer them later or get back to you. And I would now like to ask my colleague Lotte to launch our polls 5 and 6 to ask you some questions again. So the first one is your region facing coastal degradation? Yes, no, I don't know. Or maybe you don't live in a coastal region. So again, some time for you to answer. And here we have the results, so we can see that indeed your regions are facing coastal degradation, and it's something that you are mostly aware of. And as we've seen in the previous polls, probably also trying to, something you're trying to work with. And then our second poll is about coastal restoration measures. So are coastal restoration measures implemented in your region? And again, yes, no, you don't know, or you don't live in a coastal region, perhaps. So again, you have some time to answer. Thank you. And we can see that we have almost 50% of you who answered yes, which is good news, but it also means that there's still a big room for potential and for learning, because we indeed need to implement coastal restoration measures in all of coastal regions, as we have seen from the keynote presentation anyways. And 1/3 of you don't know if coastal restoration measures are implemented or not. So that's of course something to explore as well. Okay, so thank you very much. And now we will move to our presentation from Nil Alvarez Segura from EURECAT Spain, and he will talk about the challenges of coastal restoration in the Ebro Delta. So Nil, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Magda. I hope my screen is seen properly, the connection. I apologize for that. I hope you can hear me well. Is it okay?
We can hear you, but there is a little bit of delay and then a
Background
speeding up
noise.
of the voice.
I'm sorry. Maybe I will disconnect my camera if it's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. You can try that.
All right. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Just interrupt me, Magda, if you cannot follow. Okay. All right. Thanks for the introduction, for inviting me, also for the presentation, Joep. It was very interesting. I share a lot of messages that you've shown today. Well, let me introduce myself. I'm Nil Alvarez. I'm an environmental scientist. I work in EURECAT in Catalonia. We are part of the Climate Resilience Center. And today I'm talking about some challenges that we are facing in the Ebro Delta in terms of coastal restoration. I will start, sorry, because, yeah. I will start by spoiling a little bit my talk today, because what I want to explain today is why restoring the river to coast continuum is a must for our deltas to survive, right? As Joep said before, many people live in deltas, and most of them are facing the same problem and the same challenge, which is recovering these sediment inputs. But it's not only the sediment that has been retained in reservoirs, but also water, nutrient, species. So by restoring this river to coast continuum, we will recover and be able to restore our ecosystems that has been damaged or lost in some cases at the very end of the river. In the Ebro Delta case, we have seen our sediment inputs decrease by 99% since the 60s by the construction of dams. This lack of sediment, which is combined with the sea level rise and the deterioration of natural habitats, has threatened not only the ecosystems that used to and we still have in the Ebro Delta, but also it's threatening the communities and the economic activity that is living in our area, in our delta. And that is happening across the world in many other regions. If we were to recover these natural habitats of not only the flow of sediments, but also the connection with the river, we will be improving several ecosystem services that we used to have and that are crucial for adaptation in these scenarios that we're facing, and some services that we can really benefit from, such as water quality, carbon sequestration, food provisioning, and especially flooding and erosion risk reduction. Also, there is a need of naturalization the coastline and to make it more permeable and more adapted to marine storm and sea level rise. I'm going to try to explain you better now. This image shows how vulnerable this area is. This is the Ebro Delta. It's rising only a few centimeters above sea level, and this is two scenarios. In the left, the blue area is the potentially flooded area if the relative sea level rise
Nil, we are losing you
was
a little
to
bit.
be 0.25 meters. On the right, on an event of 0.5 meters, which we already know that. Have you lost me, Magda?
Yes,
Sorry.
it's
Can you
breaking.
hear me,
It's breaking up a little bit. So maybe.
Magda?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear and see you.
You're breaking up a little bit. So I would suggest that we share your presentation.
Okay.
Maybe it's going to be easier like that. So
Should I keep my camera off so the connection is slightly better?
Yes, I think you can.
Can you still hear me, Magda?
Now it's a bit better. So let's try like this.
Okay. Oh, sorry for that.
No worries.
Yeah, you can skip this one. That was to show how vulnerable the area was. And this image also is very impressive. A marine storm that hit our coast in 2020, and the results of not only the sea washing inland, but also the rainfall resulted in an area which you can see in the satellite image. Can you pass to the next screen, please? Okay. We have to restore somehow, or we have to guarantee, right? So we need this hydrological connectivity to be recovered, so the sediment inputs can arrive to the ecosystems, in this case to the wetlands, that can store and accumulate them. But we need also plant productivity, so the elevation capital is possible, and also very important, we need room for migration for this ecosystem. So we cannot understand a coastline in a delta which is not slightly dynamic. So we cannot pretend to fix our ecosystems, at least here in the Ebro Delta, and we need some room for migration. That's why we talk about restoring processes instead of restoring habitats, for instance. In the next slide, I'm going to explain a little bit better about this room for migration. Yeah, that's what we call the coastal squeeze. So it's important that we recover those processes, but also that we plan for the ecosystem to adapt by its own manner. So if we place a wall right after our wetland, for instance, it won't have the ability to migrate inland or outland, depending on the dynamics, and eventually it will lose its ability and its functionalities. So it's important also, as Joep was saying before, that the governance is taken into account, and the planning is a long-term planning and not a single action or a punctual action. Continue with the next slide, please. Yeah, those are only, I'm almost finishing, so I hope we have some time for discussion, but this was only a tiny example of what we are doing as a group, but that's a small proportion of the projects that have been developed in our region. The first one, the Life Ebro Miclim, actually feeded the Lands Interreg Europe with its good practices and its results. And what we did here, it was to test the sediment transport through river and irrigation channels. And we assessed also the vulnerable areas to sea level rise and the flooding hazard zones. We also developed a climate action plan for the Ebro Delta, among other tasks. The next two projects are ongoing projects. The West Coast is promoting large-scale restoration of coastal ecosystems. And we are taking attention not only into technical aspects, also financial aspects and barriers and enablers, but we also focus, and we put the focus on the governance models that can trigger this transition. And in the BioResilMed, which is a national project, we're implementing bioeconomy models to better adapt the Ebro Delta. I'm explaining this because it's a combination of all of these that will make a successful adaptation plan to actually make a difference in areas which are as vulnerable as deltas. And yeah, I have a final conclusion slide, so we can start discussing if you want to. I wanted only to stress that coastal systems will not survive if climate change impacts unless we reconnect them with the river basin, and we give room to this coast to beat this coastal squeeze that I was explaining before. These two things are crucial for these systems to adapt and to actually mitigate the effects of the climate change. By restoring those sediment these flags of sediment, we will be benefiting not only environmental aspects, but also economic and social, as Joep was saying before. And finally, repeating what I've said before, the governance must be considered as one of the challenges to address the problem if we want our deltas to be managed as natural ecosystems. And this is everything from my side. I can try and connect the camera again. I'm very sorry. I hope you could follow. You could hear me well.
Thank you, Nil. It gets better in the second half. So, so that was good. Luckily,
sorry.
Yeah, sometimes that happens. That's okay. Anyways, thanks a lot for sharing all the work that you are doing and the different approaches and the challenges that you have. The restoration works, it seems like a very complex project where you need to involve a lot of stakeholders. What would you say from your experience is crucial to start such a coastal restoration project?
Yeah, well, as you said, it's what we found crucial, and actually we shouldn't start any restoration action without that in mind, is to involve all the stakeholders which are relevant for what we are planning to do. Because in the past, we've tried doing our own activities and restoring areas by deciding what was best in terms of ecological status, but then not taking into account the other land uses of the territory, the other needs, makes it a lot less efficient and a lot less well seen by the community. So our approach is to have on board the at least quadruple helix, right? Having the administration, the economic sector, also the societal NGOs and academics all together deciding what's best.
Thank you. I would also like to ask Joep, what do you think of the work done in Ebro Delta?
I mean, to me, it sounds excellent, and I mean, it's hard to have a judgment on just the presentation, but it sounds very exciting. I had a question to Nil: is what is the story you tell to policymakers, and what's the story you tell to the people living there, and how do they respond?
Well, the story is simple to explain if you go with what we are talking today, right? If you show them the future and the results of not acting. Thing is that the governance is quite complex. It's not always the same vision is not always shared. So it really depends a lot. If we go to the administration, we work in different levels. We work with regional and local governments, but also we try to have an effect on national laws. And that's why it was one of the 3 key points. I only wanted to stress 3 things at the end. And the governance is something that it's a huge challenge to tackle, because at least in our region, there are different layers of administration, decision makers, and they don't always necessarily share the same opinions, share the same vision. So our work tries to actually put them in the same line so we can plan for the future more ahead than few years.
We also have we also have a question from one of the participants, and she asks, it's very inspiring to see you're looking at ecosystem based. You're looking at it from like ecosystems points of view, not from the point of a specific species. Is it correct that you are working in Natura 2000 area?
Yeah. Sorry, because I'm losing the connection, but I'm reading the question. Yeah, it is correct. Most of the coastline of the Ebro Delta is a Natura 2000 area. We have different figures of protection, but the system here is that the natural beat is a shallow and narrow line, and then actually it's also part of the Natura 2000 area, but we have economic activity, which is farming, rice growing, and that's why we don't have this room for the ecosystem to evolve, and we suffer this squeezing that I was trying to explain in the presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Nil. If there is any more questions, Astrid?
Yeah, I was wondering, it's good that you mentioned it, Nil. Thank you very much for your presentation. I was wondering how you deal with this issues that you have. Joep was presenting that this is also having an economic impetus, and you're actually dealing with some economic actors which are suffering from the climate impact, but at the same time reluctant on the climate adaptation measures, if I understand it well. So how do you overcome this this issue? Is it just with communication, or do you work together with them? How is this working?
No, we actually work together, because what we are, part of our work now is actually trying to have an effect on the territory and how the economic activities plan, right? Because we believe, as Joep was mentioning before also, that it's economically not viable but positive to invest on natural adaptation. So we are trying and actually hoping to help shift the economic activities towards natural capital and towards conservation, because that will have a double benefit. It will adapt us better to climate change, but it will as well be a way to actually implement those adaptations by having these inflows from the economic sector to restoring those processes, those systems that I was mentioning.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the questions as well. And now we can move to our second presentation. So our next speaker is Massimiliano Costa from Parco Delta del Po in Italy. Hello, Massimiliano.
Hello.
And he's actually joining us today from the coast. However, not the Italian coast, but a Greek coast. And
Yes.
He will talk about the restoration measures in the Po Delta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The next, immediately, this is just the title. There is a short introduction just to know where the Po Delta Park is in northeast Italy, is below Venice, between Venice and Rimini, more or less. It's a large regional park, 54,000 hectares, and it's involving 75 kilometers of coastline. So it's a very large coastal area. The next, please. It's not just a regional park, but it's also a network of Natura 2000 sites and of Ramsar wetlands. And the next, because it's also a World Heritage and Biosphere Reserve. So it's a very important area, both from the natural point of view and the cultural point of view. And the next, please. The landscape are now still fascinating, even if the man changed a lot. No, the next is fine. This was just a even if the man changed a lot, the environment and the landscape and the territory because of the drainage, there are still a lot of natural areas, more than 22,000 hectares of wetlands, mainly brackish water wetlands. And because of climate change, it's really difficult now to preserve the 2,500 hectares of freshwater wetlands because it's raining less and less and the sea level is rising. So this kind of picture is more and more difficult to maintain. The next, please. In this natural area, we have very important because of the coastline of Emilia-Romagna that is really used by tourism. We have still 15 kilometers, 300 hectares of natural dunes. And this is very important, most of all for the Kentish plover. The next, please. Then the 20,000 hectares of brackish lagoons and wetlands are very important for also for some economical activities such as fishing and seashell harvesting. And here we have a big colony of flamingo that now is a kind of icon for the park. And the next, please. The coastal erosion in this area is a big problem. We see this is a point with a strong coastal erosion, and the problem in this area is that I mean, all the authorities are working to preserve the coastline where there are man activities, and in the 15 kilometers of natural areas, it's really difficult to find resources, money to make intervention to preserve these habitats. And my fear is that in I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years, we will have protection only for the towns, only for the places where there are man activities, but like tourism or agriculture. But in these areas, we will just have a line of stones, as you see down on the left, and the sea by one side, agriculture by the other side. And this is, of course, a disaster for nature conservation. The next, please. Another problem is that if only the beach used for tourism will be preserved, we will have only beach like this and not the natural ones. The 90% in our region are populated by umbrellas, as you see in this picture, but the small 10% that we are still trying to preserve is very important and is very threatened by climate change. The next, please. Another problem is that all the combined effects, both of climate change and also of some man activity like subsidence, but also the rising of the sea level, the erosion, because of the stronger and stronger storms, the simplification caused by man in wetlands, sometimes they are causing lagoon degradation because the salinization is increasing and all the gradient, the difference between the salt level, the salt in water is changing, and it's becoming the same everywhere. I mean, the sea is winning the competition with the fresh water, and all the water is at the same salt level. And that is, of course, a big simplification for the habitats that are becoming all the same. And when the salt is so much, then we also have problem with increased turbidity because of the microalgae that are living in the water and because of the lack of oxygen. The next, please. So now some project that we had trying to change something, giving a value, for example, also for the natural areas, like in the project Delta Lady, we were trying to evaluate the ecosystem services that the natural lagoons by the sea give to the tourism. And this is to make the policymaker understand that it's worth also to save these kind of habitats, and not just the touristic beach, not just agriculture, not just the town by the sea shoreline. And the next, please. We also made not just a project for enhancement of the coastal lagoons, but also for their restoration. This is a project that was financed by Horizon 2020 and was the building of a natural dune to preserve a natural area that is threatened by coastal erosion. It was working really well. And now we presented another one. It was financed, also the second that has another name, no more operando, but Land for Climate, because the land solution, nature-based solution, are helping to preserve the coastline from coastal erosion. The next, please. It's another coastal restoration experience that I was talking about. We will try the same solution in another part of the coastline that is completely natural, as you can see in the picture on the left, trying to preserve the small lagoon that now is really threatened by coastal erosion, and it lost 200 meters of beach. Now the beach is really a short stripe before the sea, and it's the only line that is still protecting this very important lagoon. And this will start this year, this project. And the next, please. Another project of coastal restoration experience is the Life Agree that was carried on a big lagoon that is used for most of all for the breeding of Ruditapes philippinarum, that is a seashell, very well appreciated by the economical point of view, is a very important activity. And this project was trying to face the effect of coastal erosion that is accumulating sand in places where the fishermen are breeding the shell, moving this sand and using the sand to restore the coastal line where it's under erosion. And it worked really well. This project had really good results, also in the involvement of fishermen that were paying part of the activities of the life. And the next, please. It's another life project for restoration. The reason, because I'm in Greece now, this is a life going on to.
Please conclude, Massimiliano.
Yes. Trying to restore the habitat lagoon by planting these the seawater plants that are very important for the lagoon habitat. The next, I think, is the last, more or less. It's another project that is starting soon. We'll start in July to build natural reef with oysters and polychaetes to protect the coastline using these natural solution that are the natural reef of living animals. The next, I hope it's the last. It's a project that we did last year to fight against the erosion that is closing the mouth of this lagoon, because the sand that is moved always by the sea is at the end stocked in front of this channel mouth and is closing the lagoon, and the lagoon has no more the connection with the sea. So we are trying a new solution with poles, with natural barriers to protect the mouth of the channel. The next, please. I always hope it's the last. This is another defense that was made in the same way in about 15 years ago, that is still working, was made with wood. So this is just to say that we don't have always to use concrete and stones and other hard solution, but in the sea, it's sometimes enough to use wood or really soft solution to move the sand and to stop the sand where we want it to stop without invasive activities. The next, please. And yeah, this is the last. This is about rules. I mean, another important thing is to have really strict rules to protect the natural beach, because they are really delicate environment, delicate habitat their ecosystem is really threatened by also by man passing. So this is very important. In the rule of the park, there are some really precise rules to preserve birds, vegetation, and all the animals and plants living on the natural beach. The next should be the last. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massimiliano. Thanks for this very beautiful presentation. It's very nice to have all the pictures and see the Natura 2000 sites and brackish wetlands and dunes and flamingos. Very beautiful region indeed. You have presented a wide range of different restoration measures and different approaches that you've tried. And you've also mentioned that Delta regions in general are often struggling with finding finance for conservation measures and for nature protection. Are there any of the presented solutions which you would maybe recommend or prioritize if you had to choose due to limited financial resources?
I think now in the Po Delta, the main problem is to maintain the water quality and the water salinity, the different salinities, to preserve the fresh water, to preserve the brackish water, and to have this slow, different scale, different level of water quality. So I think that the maintenance of the freshwater intake and the maintenance of the open to the sea is now, I think, the main issue in our area.
Thank you. I would also like to ask you to put any questions in the chat, and I would first give the word to you, Joep Verhagen, if you have any questions for Massimiliano.
Yeah, thank you, Massimiliano, for this excellent and very interesting presentation. You emphasize a lot the importance of nature-based solutions. Could you tell us a bit more about the potential, but also the limitations of nature-based solutions?
Yeah. For example, something that we see is that where there are natural dunes on the coastline, even if there are never intervention to preserve the seashore, the 15 kilometers are very well better, I mean, resisting to the effect of the sea storm than the other 60 kilometers that are used by man. Probably because the use is simplifying also the level of the sand that is not straight, not flat in the natural condition, and it's really working against the waves. Otherwise, if you have a touristic beach that is really flat and the waves can go in for 100 meters, and that is something that is for sure working. I mean, that is a good natural based solution to rebuild dunes. And there is a municipality of the park that started to do this. And in their 20 kilometers of beach, they are starting to build dunes to preserve the villages and the tourism behind. And another important thing of natural based solution that is now really actual. I mean, it's really a good example now, because we had a big flood 2 weeks ago in the area of the park, and none of the wetlands of the park are connected directly with the rivers, because in the past 100 years ago they were separated by banks. Now would have been really important to put the water of the rivers in the wetlands, and it's not a problem for the wetlands because they are freshwater wetlands. In many cases, the water is helping to preserve the habitat. So it's our problem to find fresh water, but they are divided. Now would have been good also to preserve the inland from flooding, but it was impossible because there was not there were not connections between rivers and wetlands. I think that this could be a good natural based solution to prepare wetlands to be used as a flooding area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Massimiliano. That's a very good recommendation, I think. We also have one question in the chat from Katarina. In the Horizon project you presented, where you built a dune, where did you take the sand for the restoration of the dune from?
We took the sand from some area where there is a huge deposition, because you know, when the coastal erosion is taking away the sand from one part of the park, then it's anyway stopping somewhere else. So there are beaches that are really disappearing, and other ones that are really increasing. Part of the beach of the sand was from there, and another part was from the opening of the mouth of the channels that are connecting the lagoons with the sea, because these are always closing. We always have to dig, and we take away sand, and the sand we use for the sand dune. And the plants that were planted on the dune were taken around. The seeds were taken, making a temporary cultivation of the plants, and then the plants were planted over the sand dune. So everything was really local.
Yeah, very interesting. Do we have any more questions from our participants or our speakers? Astrid, do you have a question? Or
yeah, I was just also wondering on the issue of the sand. I don't know if Nil is still with us, because I remember from our visit to the Delta that you also had some problems with the sand, moving the sand around. But I don't know if Nil, are you know, what is your take on the sand and the sediments? You have been working on that a lot.
Some actions that, of course, until the sediment flux is restored, which is long from now, there are some actions that are being taken by the government in certain points, like specific nourishing in spaces. And as Massimiliano said, normally the sun is taken from another area where it's been accumulated by the natural dynamics. Things that we also try to take into account, the potential impact of moving this sand from one place to another, and maybe reduce this impact somehow in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, great. So I think before we move to the final presentation of today, we have one last poll for you. And here we would like to ask about the ecosystem services assessment. And specifically, if your organization or region has used ecosystem services assessment. So please take some time. Maybe yes, you have used this assessment in your organization. Maybe you haven't. Maybe you don't know. And maybe you don't even know what ecosystem services are. But just from the presentations of today, you must know. And here we have the results. So about 45% of you don't know if the ecosystem service assessment has been used. 30% have used it, and 25% haven't. So it's not so many that have used the assessment. And it will be really interesting to learn a little bit more about this, and we will do that in our next presentation. So a warm welcome to Mr. David Daron, who is coming from Ireland and who will talk about the ecosystem services in coastal habitats in Ireland. So David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magda. I will open up my presentation here. You can see that, I presume?
Yes, all good.
Perfect. Yes, so it's very interesting to hear other people talking about very practical sides of ecosystem services, identifying them, and maybe how to adapt, as been the topic of this talk. My presentation today takes me back to my master thesis come paper. And what I suppose I looked to do within that, within the Delta Lady project, was to develop kind of a novel method of ecosystem services assessment and apply that to a region in the south of Ireland. It's the Blackwater Estuary in County Cork in Ireland. It is also a special area of conservation and especially protected area. And I guess the main aim of this paper was to develop a method that could be transferable as per the, I suppose, as per the guidelines of Delta Lady, and to keep this quite simple methodology exactly as simply as it was. It's very difficult to do, as it turns out, with very complex topics such as ecosystem services, which I'll discuss a bit more later on. First of all, areas that we were looking at, and they were decided by Cork County Council, were areas that might be suited to some kind of eco development. You see the Slob Bank, Clay Castle, and Ballyvergan Marsh. And we were going to try to use this as a secondary goal of the paper to inform where development might take place in Youghal, County Cork. So first of all, what did we use? The framework that we used was the Common International Classification of Ecosystem Services. And then how are we going to assess this? With Delta Lady came a regional stakeholder group. In this group was a number of regional authorities, including Cork County Council, University College Cork, the EPA, Inland Fisheries Ireland, and we also used public participation within this to gain an idea of cultural services, and also to ask their opinion on other groups of ecosystem services provisioning and regulating, to get a kind of a full cohesive perspective. So what we're assessing is the 3 sites that I've already mentioned in terms of what ecosystem services these supply. And also, as I've already kind of mentioned, we would use this as potentially a tool to inform development. Another consideration is transferability. Within Delta Lady, we were looking to build something that could be replicated elsewhere. So yes, that's the idea behind the kind of the methodology, I suppose. So what did I do exactly alongside my supervisors? We identified the sites, and then we went to an identification process. So I wanted to identify what ecosystem services were provided by each site. And I did this alongside some subject matter experts in UCC and University College Cork, and we identified what ecosystem services might be provided where. And then the assessment took place. So the regional stakeholder group that I've already mentioned, alongside the public, were used. These were given a survey to classify the importance of ecosystem services. We already kind of normalized the data of what ecosystem services were there based on how much of the services provided. It starts to get quite complex, as anyone who's done a kind of a broad scale ecosystem service will assessment will realize. And we went through kind of a data analytics phase to try to quantify ecosystem services in the different development sites. There's a whole conversation to be had around the ethical issues around valuing nature and all the likes of that. But for this case, we're going to try to quantify the different aspects and the different areas of ecosystem services, and we did. We managed to pull up some data and some interesting results, and I'll discuss, I suppose, the conclusions and why this might have been. What we found was what the RSG group and the public found most important was pollination, a regulating ecosystem service, also an intermediate service, and then followed that by a lot of cultural ecosystem services. Now, trying to compare regulating and cultural ecosystem services and provision ecosystem services and put them on one graph is quite difficult. How do we compare natural beauty with the likes of water quality regulation? It's essentially an impossible task to some degree, but we are trying to quantify these things and give this some credibility, I suppose. So when looking at the sites, then we actually scaled provisioning and regulating ecosystem services with the area provided. Again, a big assumption to make. So the Ballyvergan Marsh was quite a large area. So the sites regulating services and provisioning services did scale with that. It's also a marshland, a wetland. So it does provide quite a bit of roosting for certain bird species and also water regulation between the coast and the terrestrial land. So as we see within these sites, these provide certain breakdowns of regulating, provisioning and cultural services. These ones, Clay Castle site and Slob Bank, these were quite close to the town of Youghal. So cultural services we scaled with the use, and this was incorporated into the survey that was conducted. And these are the results we got. So what did we find? I suppose just some notes from the actual paper itself. Quite a lot of respondents, in terms of public respondents, found it difficult to understand language within the CICES. These simple descriptors within CCs were used. However, people still found it quite difficult. There's also the question to be asked about how much the public knew about certain regulating services, such as carbon sequestration within the Ballyvergan Marsh wetland. It's a complex process, and just having that one topic within a survey can throw quite a few people. And then there all comes the topic, the EPA, how much they know about kind of cultural services in the area. The public might be better informed than them. So something at conclusion we came to is a clear requirement to improve language, and also, I suppose, improve the groups that are involved in these surveys is needed. The most highly valued services was pollination, along with a suite of cultural services. This is very possibly due to ease of understanding. When you ask someone to classify something like, let's say, recreational activities in the area, people will find that much easier than to look at the spreading seed, the ability to spread seeds in that area. It becomes quite a complex topic. The ease of understanding probably weighed heavily on this in this survey. And then I suppose more discussion. What we found, especially on pollination, there is an all-Ireland pollinator plan within Ireland. So there's a lot of awareness around pollination, and it just shows that when something is accessible to people, when the information is out there and it's cohesive and it's simple for people to understand to a certain degree, people will see how important it is. The likes of the Ballyvergan Marsh, which I mentioned earlier, the fact that that's a marshland on a coastal region, can be very difficult to explain why that's important habitat to people when there are other areas around which are more suited to development alike. And yeah, I suppose some comments on the methodology used as well. To make this transferable, we had to use some very...
Please conclude, David. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. The last slide. Comment on the methodology. We used some very simplistic assumptions about how to compare different classes of ecosystem services. Even looking as the lads, as Nil and Massimiliano mentioned, like they're looking at particular ecosystem services, and you're looking at how to restore these processes, as Nil mentioned. That can be quite complex in itself. So trying to do a full assessment, a full suite assessment, might be useful to some degree, but to another degree, you do need acute awareness of what you're looking at and what you're dealing with. And yeah, that essentially concludes my my presentation. And if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, David. Very interesting presentation. And I think it's safe to say that ecosystem services assessment is an important tool, especially when it comes to valuation of the natural area and natural resources, and perhaps making it easier to understand the value of natural resource or natural areas to policymakers or to public, but as you've mentioned, it's always important to think about how to communicate that. But I think you've made a point that such assessment can be used in decision making, and that's ultimately the goal. I would like to ask Joep Verhagen again, what is your experience with the ecosystem services assessment and its used in this area?
So we, as GCA, we don't have much experience in the field of ecosystem services. That is not what we focus on. But I do have a question, and maybe that's important for all of us, is how do we communicate? How do we bridge what we find on the ecosystem services assessments, the need for restoration? How do we bridge this with the general public, right? Because that's so incredibly important. If we can't make the case in a language that appeals to people, where people feel involved and people feel this is what matters for us, we're never going to get the money and the attention that's needed.
Absolutely, it can be a difficult procedure to try to explain certain ecosystem services public, but it can be done. The likes of pollination within, I'm sure throughout Europe, just like Ireland, has been very successfully advertised, if that's the word you want to use, as an incredibly important ecosystem service in terms of what it provides to humans, in terms of food production, and just in terms of the biodiversity as well. People can see bees feed on flowers, they pollinate crops, and it's quite simple language that is used. And when you're trying to relay other ecosystem services, then a similar approach has to be taken. It has to be relayed why these are important to the individual, how an individual can act, and how you should encourage your local government to act, how they should in turn encourage government to act. I guess the aim of Delta Lady was to get ecosystem services kind of embedded in regional kind of governance and regional policy planning. And that's what it comes down to, I suppose, getting that into your kind of national, regional policies, filtering that down, and then creating understandable conversations that anybody can have. I guess I mentioned already that quite a few people had issues understanding the simple descriptors within the common between CICES, and that's what it comes down to. If you feel like you can't act, then you won't. So yeah, I guess that's my 2 cents on the topic. And it's been quite a while since I've been involved in that side. So there are there's definitely experts out there with maybe a more valid opinion than myself, but it was definitely interesting to be involved in Delta Lady and be involved in the ecosystem services assessment. So yeah.
Okay, so I think we're slowly running out of time. So if we have no more urgent questions, then I would like to take this opportunity and thank you. Big thank you to all of our speakers. It was really very interesting, all of your presentations, and some really nice discussions. Thank you, colleagues, Astrid, Lotte. I would like to also remind you that we will have a second webinar in this mini series on climate adaptation in deltas. It is taking place on the 28th of June, and we will focus on wetlands restoration this time. Also, please use our services. We offer peer reviews that I've talked about at the beginning, and matchmakings to address your policy challenges of your individual regions and municipalities. So please contact us if you're interested. It's very easy. So with this, we have reached the end of the webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. And please don't forget to fill out the survey in the end. So hopefully see you in 2 weeks, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Bye.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
you.
Thanks.
Bye bye.
Bye-bye.